Hello friends, welcome to my channel. In my channel, I am going to read you the stories of Shikar of famous hunter Jim Corbett that has kept generations of readers enthralled. Today I bring you the story of the Champawat man-eater by him. I will be presenting this story in two parts. So here goes the first part of the story, the Champawat man-eater. Jim Corbett was shooting with his friend Eddie Knowles in Malani when he first heard of the tiger, which later received official recognition as the Champawat man-eater. Eddie will long be remembered in this province as a sportsman par excellence and the possessor of an inexhaustible fund of shikar yarns, was one of those few and very fortunate individuals who possess the best of everything in life. His rifle was without equal in accuracy and striking power, and while one of his brothers was the best gunshot in India, another brother was the best tennis player in the Indian army. When therefore Eddie informed Jim Corbett that his brother in law, the best shikari in the world, had been deputed by the government to shoot the Champawat man eater, therefore it was safe to assume that a very definite period has been put to the animal's activities. The tiger, however, for some inexplicable reason, did not die and was causing the government a great deal of anxiety when he visited Nainital 4 years later. Rewards were offered, special shikaris employed, and parties of Gorkhas sent out from the depot of Almora. Yet, in spite of these measures, the toll of the human victims continued to mount alarmingly. The tigress, for such the animal turned out to be, had arrived in Kumaon as a full fledged man eater from Nepal, from whence she had been driven out by a body of armed Nepalese after she had killed 200 human beings. And during the 4 years she had been operating in Kumaon, had added 234 to this number. This was how matters stood when, shortly after his arrival in Nainital, he received a visit from Berthoud. Berthoud, who was Deputy Commissioner of Nainital at that time, and who, after his tragic death, now lies buried in an obscure grave in Halwani, was a man who was loved and respected by all who knew him, and it was not surprising, therefore, that when he told Jim Corbett of the trouble that man-eater was giving the people of his district and the anxiety it was causing him, he took his promise with him that he would start for Champawat immediately on receipt of news of the next human kill. Two conditions Jim Corbett made, however: one, that the government rewards be cancelled, and the other, special shikaris and regulars from Almora be withdrawn. His reasons for making these conditions need no explanation, for he was sure all sportsmen share his aversion to being classed as a reward hunter and were as anxious as he was to avoid the risk of being accidentally shot. These conditions were agreed to, and a week later Berthoud paid him an early morning visit and informed him that news had been brought in during the night by runners that a woman had been killed by the man eater at Pali, a village between Dabidhura and Dunaghat. In anticipation of start at short notice, he had engaged 6 men to carry his camp kit, and leaving after breakfast, they did a march the first day, 17 miles to Dhari. Breakfasting at Marnola next morning, They spent the night at Dabidhura and arrived at Pali the following evening, 5 days after the woman had been killed. The people of the village, numbering some 50 men, women, and children, were in the state of abject terror, and though the sun was still up when he arrived, he found the entire population inside their homes behind locked doors, and it was not until his men had made a fire in the courtyard and he was sitting down to a cup of tea that a door here and there was cautiously opened and the frightened inmates emerged. He was informed that for 5 days no one had gone beyond their own doorsteps. The insanitary condition of the courtyard testified to the truth of this statement. The food was running short, and that the people would starve if the tiger was not killed or driven away. That the tiger was still in the vicinity was apparent. For 3 nights it had been heard calling on the road, distant 100 yards from the houses, and that very day it had been seen on the cultivated land at the lower end of the village. The headman of the village very willingly placed the room at his disposal, but as there were 8 of them to share it, and the only door it possessed opened on to the insanitary courtyard, he elected to spend the night in the open. After a scratch meal, which had to do duty for dinner, he saw his men safely shut into the room and himself took up a position on the side of the road with his back to the tree. The villagers said the tiger was in the habit of perambulating along this road, and as the moon was at the full, he thought there was a chance of getting a shot provided he saw it first. He had spent many nights in the jungle looking for game, but this was the first time he had ever spent a night looking for a man eater. The length of the road immediately in front of him was brilliantly lit by the moon, but to the right and left the overhanging trees cast dark shadows, and when the night wind agitated the branches and the shadow moved, he saw a dozen tigers advancing on him and bitterly regretted the impulse that he had induced him to place himself at the man eater's mercy. He was too frightened to carry out his self imposed task, and with teeth chattering as much from fear as from cold, he sat out the long night, and as the grey dawn was lighting up the snowy range which he was facing, he rested his head on his drawn up knees, and it was in this position his men found him an hour later, fast asleep, and of the tiger he had neither heard nor seen anything. Back in the village, the men were very surprised that he had survived the night. He tried to get the men in the village to take him to the places where the people of the village had from time to time been killed, but this they were unwilling to do. From the courtyard, they pointed out the direction in which the kills had taken place. The last kill, the one that had brought him to the spot, he was told had taken place round the shoulder of the hill to the west village. The women and girls, some 20 in number, who had been out collecting oak leaves for their cattle when the unfortunate woman had been killed, were eager to give Jim Corbett the details of the occurrence. It appeared that the party had set out 2 hours before midday and, after going half a mile, had climbed into trees to cut leaves. The victim and 2 other women had selected a tree growing on the edge of a ravine. It was about 4 feet deep and 10 to 12 feet wide. Having cut all the leaves she needed, the woman was climbing down from the tree when the tiger, who had approached unseen, stood up on its hind legs and caught her by the foot. Her hold was torn from the branch she was letting herself down by, and pulling her into the ravine, the tiger released her foot. And while she was struggling to rise, the tiger caught her by the throat. After killing her, it sprang up to the side of the ravine and disappeared with her into some heavy undergrowth. All this had taken place a few feet from the two women on the tree and had been witnessed by the entire party. As soon as the tiger and its victim were out of sight, the terror stricken women and girls ran back to the village. The men, who had just come in for their midday meal, were all assembled and armed with drums, metal cooking pots, anything in fact that would produce a sound, and set off to rescue the victim with the women behind them. After arriving at the ravine in which the woman had been killed, they tried to revive her, but the tiger interrupted the proceedings by emitting a loud roar every time they tried to do so. One of the villagers was armed with a gun and fired a shot in the air. It brought the tiger roaring out of the bushes, after which the attempted rescue was very wisely abandoned. Jim Corbett walked around the village for 3 hours that morning around the village, looking for tracks and hoping and dreading at the same time to meet the tiger. At one place in the dark, heavily wooded ravine, while he was striking some bushes, a covey of college pheasants fluttered screaming out of them, and Jim Corbett thought that his heart stopped beating for good. Jim Corbett's men had cleared a spot under a walnut tree for his meals, and after breakfast, the headman of the village asked him to mount guard while the wheat crop was being cut. He said that if the crop was not harvested in his presence, it would not be harvested at all, for the people were too frightened to leave their homes. Half an hour later, the entire population of the village, assisted by Jim Corbett's men, were hard at work while he stood on guard with a loaded rifle. By evening, the crop from the 5 large fields had been gathered, leaving only 2 small patches close to the houses, which the headman said he would have no difficulty in dealing with the next day. By this time, Jim Corbett had been provided with a second room at his disposal, and that night, with thorn bushes securely wedged in the doorway to admit ventilation and exclude the man eater, he made up for the sleep that he had lost the previous night. His presence was beginning to put new heart into the people, and they were moving about more freely. But he had not yet gained their confidence sufficiently to renew his request of being shown round the jungle, to which he attached some importance. These people knew every foot of the ground for miles round, and could, if they wished, show him where he was most likely to find the tiger, or in any case where he could see its pug marks. That the man eater was a tiger was an established fact, but it was not known whether the animal was young or old, a male or a female, and this information, which he believed would help him to get in touch with, he could only ascertain by examining its pug marks. After an early tea that morning, Jim Corbett announced that he wanted meat for his men and asked the villagers if they could direct him to where he could shoot a ghural, that is a mountain goat. The village was situated on the top of a long ridge running east and west, and just below the road on which he had spent the night The hill fell steeply away to the north in a series of grassy slopes, and on these grassy slopes, he was told, Ghural were plentiful. Several men volunteered to show Jim Corbett over the ground, but he selected 3 men and set out with them. He told the headman that if he found the Ghural as plentiful as he said they were, he would shoot 2 for the village in addition to shooting 1 for his men. The expedition was a great success in more ways than one. In addition to providing a ration of meat for everyone, it gained Jim Corbett the confidence of the entire village. Later on in the day, the headman asked him where he wanted to go and how many men he wished to take with him. He selected 2 of his late companions and set off to visit the scene of the last human tragedy. The people of the hills were Hindus and cremate their dead, and when one of their number had been carried off by a man eater, it is incumbent on the relatives to recover some portion of the body for cremation, even if it be only a few splinters of bone. In the case of this woman, the cremation ceremony was yet to be performed, and as they started out, the relatives requested them to bring back any portion of the body they might find. From his early boyhood, Jim Corbett had made a hobby of reading and interpreting jungle signs. In the present case, he had the account of the eyewitnesses who were present when the woman was killed, but eyewitnesses were not always reliable, whereas jungle signs were a true record of all that had transpired. On arrival at the spot, a glance at the ground showed him that the tiger could only have approached the tree one way without being seen, and that was up the ravine. Entering the ravine 100 yards below the tree and working up, he found the pug marks of the tiger in some fine earth that had shifted down between 2 big rocks. These pug marks showed the animal to be a tigress, a little past her prime. Further up the ravine, and some 10 yards from the tree, the tigress had lain down behind a rock, presumably to wait for the woman to climb down from the tree. The victim had been the first to cut all the leaves she needed, and as she was letting herself down by a branch, some 2 inches in diameter, the tigress had crept forward and standing up on her hind legs, had caught the woman by the foot and pulled her down into the ravine. The branch showed the desperation with which the unfortunate woman had clung to it, for adhering to the rough oak bark where the branch and eventually the leaves had slipped through her grasp were strands of skin which had been torn from the palms of her hands and fingers. Where the tigress had killed the woman, there were signs of a struggle and a big patch of dried blood. From there, the blood trail, then dry but distinctly visible, led across the ravine and up the opposite bank. Following the blood trail from where it left the ravine, they found the places in the bushes where the tigress had eaten her kill. It was a popular belief that man eaters did not eat the head, hands, and feet of the human victims. This was incorrect. Man eaters, if not disturbed, eat everything, including the blood soaked clothes, as if found on one occasion. On present occasion, they found the woman's clothes and a few pieces of bones, which they wrapped up in the clean cloth that they had brought for the purpose. Pitifully little as those remains were, they would suffice for the cremation ceremony, which would ensure the ashes of the high caste women reaching Mother Ganges. After tea, Jim Corbett visited yet another scene of tragedy. Separated from the main village by the public road was a small holding of a few acres. The owner of this holding had built himself a hut on the hillside just above the road. The man's wife and the mother of his two children, a boy and a girl, aged 4 and 6 respectively, was the younger of the two sisters. These two sisters were out cutting grass one day on the hill above the hut when the tigress suddenly appeared and carried off the elder sister. For 100 yards, the younger woman ran after the tigress to let her sister go and take her instead. This incredible act of heroism was witnessed by the people in the main village. After carrying the dead woman for 100 yards, the tigress put her down and turned on her pursuer. With a loud roar, it sprang at the brave woman, who turning raced down the hillside, across the road, and into the village, evidently with the intention of telling the people what they, unknown to her, had already witnessed. The woman's incoherent noises were at the time attributed to loss of breath, fear, and excitement, and it was not until the rescue party that had set out with all speed had returned unsuccessful that it was found the woman had lost her power of speech and had been dumb for 12 months. Jim Corbett had come with the avowed object of shooting the man eater, but with an animal that had the reputation of never killing twice in the same locality, never returning to a kill, and whose domain extended to an area of many hundred square miles, the chance of him accomplishing his object was as good as finding a needle in two haystacks. Further, there was no one he could ask for advice, for this was the first man eater that had ever been known in Komau, and yet something had to be done. So for the next 3 days he wandered through the jungle from sunrise to sunset, visiting all the places for miles around, where the villagers told him there was a chance of seeing the tigress. But it seemed that the tigress appeared to have left that locality, and Jim Corbett decided, much to the regret of the people of Pali, to move to Champawat, 15 miles due east of Pali. He made an early start and completed the journey to Champawat by sunset. The roads in this area were considered very unsafe, and men only moved from village to village or to the markets in large parties. Jim Corbett's party of 8 was added to by men from villages adjoining the road, and they arrived at Champawat 30 strong. Some of the men who had joined him had been in a party of 20 men who had visited Champawat 2 months earlier, and they told him the following very pitiful story. The road for a few miles on that side of Champawat ran along the south face of the hill, parallel to and about 50 yards above the valley. 2 months ago, a party of 20 men, some of whom had joined Jim Corbett, were on their way to the market at Champawat, and as they were going along the length of the road at about midday, they were startled by hearing the agonized cries of a human being coming from the valley below. Huddled together on the edge of the road, the men cowered down in fright as the cries drew nearer and nearer, and presently into view came a tiger carrying a woman without any clothes on her body. The woman's hair was trailing on the ground on one side of the tiger, and her feet on the other. The tiger was holding her by the small of her back, and as she was calling alternately on God and men to help her. 50 yards from, and in clear view of the men, the tiger passed with its burden, and when the cries had died away in the distance, they continued on their way. The men told Jim Corbett that they did nothing to rescue the woman because they were afraid. He subsequently learned that the victim belonged to a village near Champawat and that she had been carried off by the tiger while collecting dry sticks. Her companions had run back to the village and raised an alarm, and just as the rescue party was starting, the 20 men arrived. As these men knew the direction in which the tiger had gone with its victim, they joined the party. They were 50 or 60 strong when they set out to rescue the woman, and several of the party were armed with guns. A furlong from where the sticks collected by the woman were lying and from where she had been carried off, they found her torn clothes. Thereafter, the men started beating their drums and firing off their guns, and in this way they proceeded for more than a mile right up to the head of the valley, where they found the woman, who was a little more than a girl, lying dead on a great slab of rock. Beyond licking off all the blood and making her body clean, the tiger had not touched her. The men wrapped her body in the loin clothes which one and another gave. The Tehsildar of Champawat, to whom Jim Corbett had been given letters of introduction, paid him a visit that night at the dak bungalow where he was putting up and suggested he should move next day to a bungalow a few miles away, in the vicinity of which many human beings had been killed. Early next morning, accompanied by the Tehsildar, Jim Corbett set out for the bungalow, and while he was having breakfast on the veranda, two men arrived with news that a cow had been killed by a tiger in a village 10 miles away. The Tehsildar excused himself to attend to some urgent work at Champawat. Jim Corbett's men were good walkers, and as the track went downhill most of the way, they covered the 10 miles in record time. Arriving at the village, he was taken to a cattle shed in which he found a week old calf killed and partly eaten by a leopard. Not having the time or the inclination to shoot the leopard, he rewarded his guides and retraced his steps to the bungalow. As there was still an hour or more of daylight left, he went out with the chowkidar of the bungalow to look at a place where he informed him of a tiger who was in the habit of drinking. This place he found to be the head of the spring which supplied the garden with irrigation water. In the soft earth round the spring were tiger pug marks several days old, but these tracks were quite different from the pug marks he had seen in the ravine in which the woman from Pali village had been killed. Jim Corbett spent the following morning in going around the very extensive fruit orchard and tea garden, and in having a bath at the spring, and at about midday the Tehsildar returned safely from Champawat. He was standing, talking to him, while looking down a long sloping hill with a village surrounded by cultivated land in the distance, when he saw a man leave the village and start up the hill in their direction. Telling the Tehsildar he would return in a few minutes, Jim Corbett set off at a run down the hill, and when the man saw him coming, he sat down to take breath. As soon as he was near enough to hear him, the man told Jim Corbett to come quickly, as the man eater had just killed a girl. Jim Corbett told the man to sit still and turning, ran up to the bungalow. He passed the news on to the Tehsildar while he was getting a rifle and some cartridges and asked him to follow him down to the village. At the village, an excited crowd of men, women, and children awaited them. Jim Corbett led one man aside and asked him to tell what had happened. Pointing to some scattered oak trees on a gentle slope a furlong or so from the village, he said a dozen people were collecting dry sticks under the trees when a tiger suddenly appeared and caught one of their number, a girl 16 or 17 years of age. The rest of the parties had run back to the village, and as it was known that Jim Corbett was staying at the bungalow, a man had immediately been dispatched to inform him. The wife of the man he spoke to had been of the party, and she pointed out the tree on the shoulder of the hill under which the girl had been taken. None of the party had looked back to see if the tiger was carrying away its victim, and if so, in which direction it had gone. Jim Corbett set off in the direction of the tree. The ground there was quite open, and it was difficult to conceive how an animal the size of the tiger could have approached 12 people unseen, its presence not detected until attention had been attracted by the choking sound made by the girl. So, guys, this is where the first part of the story ends. See you soon with the second part of the story.